Carlo Gambino spent more than 50 years in the American Mafia and served only 22 months in prison. He worked as a loyal underboss, earned his boss's trust, and then sent gunmen into a barbershop to kill him. That betrayal made Gambino the most powerful crime boss in America. This is the real Carlo Gambino story, and it makes Scarface look soft. Section 1. The Stowaway from Palermo. August 24, 1902. Palermo, Sicily. A neighborhood called Passo di Regano, tucked into the western edge of the city, where the streets were narrow and the rules that mattered most were never written down. Carlo Gambino was born into a family that already had ties to the Sicilian Mafia, the organization locals called the Honored Society. He grew up understanding, from a very young age, that the men who moved quietly through that world were the ones who lasted. The loud ones rarely did. By the time he was a teenager, sources suggest Gambino had already been initiated into the mafia in Sicily, making him a rare case of a man who arrived in America already carrying that status. He was 19 when he decided to leave, not on a passenger liner, not with legal papers. On December 23, 1921, he climbed aboard a ship called the SS Vincenzo Florio as a stowaway. The vessel docked in Norfolk, Virginia. From there, Gambino made his way north to Brooklyn, where his cousins the Castellanos had already set up a life inside New York's criminal underground. Brooklyn in the early 1920s was a city within a city. Thousands of Sicilian immigrants had settled there, and within that community, the mafia was not some foreign concept. It was familiar territory. Gambino walked straight into it. His cousins were connected to a powerful East Coast boss named Salvatore D'Aquila, and Gambino went to work for D'Aquila almost immediately after arriving. He had no period of adjustment, no years spent figuring out where he fit. He already knew. Prohibition made those early years enormously profitable for anyone willing to break the law, and Gambino was very willing. He worked as a low-level bootlegger across Brooklyn, running moonshine from basement stills, helping to smuggle rum in from the Caribbean, and occasionally visiting speakeasy owners to suggest, in terms that left little room for argument, that they should buy their liquor exclusively from his boss. It was unglamorous work. Gambino did it without complaint, and without drawing attention to himself. D'Aquila was killed in 1928 by rival boss Giuseppe Masseria, and Gambino did what he had already learned to do. He shifted his loyalty quickly and cleanly, moving into the Masseria camp without drama. Then came the Castellamarese War, a brutal 2-year conflict between Masseria's faction and a rival group under Salvatore Maranzano. When Lucky Luciano orchestrated the murders of both Masseria and Maranzano in 1931 and restructured the entire American Mafia into the five-family system, Gambino emerged on the right side again. He always did. His only federal conviction came in 1937 for tax evasion tied to an illegal distillery operation run out of Philadelphia. He served 22 months. In 50 years of crime, that was the only time the government successfully put him behind bars. For a man operating at the highest level of organized crime for most of that time, it was an almost unbelievable record. During World War II, while other criminals scrambled to stay afloat, Gambino became a millionaire. The wartime rationing system required Americans to use government-issued stamps to purchase goods like meat, butter, and gasoline. Gambino ran a black market operation dealing in stolen and counterfeit ration stamps on a massive scale. By the time the war ended, he had quietly accumulated wealth that most of his peers never came close to matching. Through all of this, the man drawing the least attention in any room was Gambino. Small in stature, with a prominent nose and a grin that witnesses consistently described as warm and disarming, he looked more like a neighborhood grocer than the calculating operator he actually was. The FBI barely tracked him during this period. The press ignored him entirely, while more colorful gangsters grabbed headlines, went to prison, and made powerful enemies. Gambino was accumulating money, building relationships, and waiting. Gambino accepted the position of underboss in 1951, handed to him by Albert Anastasia, who had just seized full control of the family after making its previous leaders disappear. He said very little about any of it. He smiled his warm smile, settled into the role, and started watching for openings. 6 years later, he found one. For 3 decades, Gambino stayed patient, stayed quiet, and let other men take the spotlight. What he was quietly building toward was a murder in a Manhattan barbershop. Section 2. The man in the barber's chair. Albert Anastasia had a nickname that said everything about how he operated: the Lord High Executioner. He ran Murder Inc., the enforcement wing that killed hundreds of men across America through the 1930s and 1940s. Anastasia seized control of his own family in 1951 by having its boss, Vincent Mangano, erased. Philip Mangano was shot 3 times and found in the marshlands of Jamaica Bay. Vincent disappeared the same day and was never found. Anastasia told the commission afterward that Mangano had been plotting to kill him first. Frank Costello backed the story. The other bosses accepted it. Anastasia became boss. Sitting one rank below him through all of this was Carlo Gambino, who took careful note of every detail. He watched his boss reach the top by betraying the man above him, and nobody above Anastasia seemed to notice how carefully Gambino was paying attention. He kept his head down, played the loyal underboss, and quietly filed the lesson away. Several things were working against Anastasia by 1957. He had been trying to muscle into the Havana casino operations controlled by Meyer Lansky and Florida boss Santo Trafficante. The other families on the commission were growing uneasy. Anastasia had also reportedly been selling mafia membership to civilians willing to pay for it, a serious breach of everything the organization held sacred. Vito Genovese, who wanted to position himself as the dominant force in New York, was watching all of this closely. Genovese approached Gambino with a proposal. If Gambino helped remove Anastasia, Gambino would take over as boss of the family, and Genovese would secure the position on the commission he had been angling toward. Gambino agreed. What followed was one of the coldest arrangements in the history of American organized crime. Gambino had spent 6 years at Anastasia's side, trusted completely. Anastasia never had reason to think otherwise. Friday morning, October 25, 1957, Anastasia was driven from his home in New Jersey into Manhattan for a routine visit to his barber at the Park Sheraton Hotel on 7th Avenue. His bodyguard stepped away shortly after they arrived, for reasons that were never satisfactorily explained. Anastasia settled into the barber's chair, draped in a cape, facing the mirror. The barber got to work. 2 men walked in with scarves covering their faces. They shoved the barber aside and opened fire. 10 shots at close range. Anastasia lurched up from the chair, wounded and disoriented, and lunged toward his attackers. He hit the mirror instead, charging at their reflections, and collapsed to the floor. He was 55 years old. Police arrived within minutes. Both gunmen were already gone. The barber and the other staff said nothing useful. No one was ever charged, and no one was ever convicted. Gambino's name came up almost immediately among investigators as the likely organizer of the murder, but that was as far as it went. He was questioned, answered each question calmly, and walked away without consequence. Within days, Gambino presented himself to the other family bosses as the new head of what had been the Anastasia family. The commission recognized him without objection. The transition was remarkably smooth. Gambino then did something that said everything about the kind of leader he intended to be. He held no ceremony, made no announcements, and went quietly back to work. Anastasia had led through fear and noise. He was loud, unpredictable, and prone to sudden decisions that rattled even his own people. Gambino ran things in a completely different way. The murder itself had a quiet logic, planned precisely, executed quickly, cleaned up completely, and never officially traced back to the man who ordered it. Having watched Anastasia use betrayal from within to climb to the top in 1951, Gambino now understood that method better than most. He applied it with far more patience and discipline than his teacher ever managed, leaving no evidence that could be traced. For the next 19 years, he would spend considerable energy making sure no one around him became ambitious or desperate enough to try the same thing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Anastasia's murder handed Gambino a family. What he did in the weeks that followed would give him something much larger than that. Section 3. The Frame. 3 weeks after Albert Anastasia died in that Manhattan barbershop, Vito Genovese called a meeting. He had arranged the killing alongside Gambino, had pushed Frank Costello out of power months earlier, and believed the moment had arrived to formally announce his position as the dominant force in American organized crime. The meeting was set for November 14, 1957, at the rural estate of a mobster named Joseph Barbara Sr. in a small upstate New York town called Appalachin. More than 100 of the most powerful organized crime figures in the country converged on the property, arriving from across the United States and from Italy and Cuba as well. A New York State police sergeant named Edgar Croswell had been watching Barbara's property for some time before that day. When he noticed dozens of expensive out-of-state vehicles converging on the estate, he called for backup and set up roadblocks on the surrounding roads. The men inside spotted the police arriving, Some ran for the woods in their suits and dress shoes. Others tried to drive out through the exits and were stopped at the checkpoints. 58 men were detained and identified. The list read like a directory of nearly every significant organized crime figure operating in America. The damage was enormous. For decades, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly insisted that a national organized crime network simply did not exist. Appalachin made that position impossible to hold. Almost overnight, federal resources began flowing toward organized crime investigation in ways that had never happened before. Robert Kennedy, then chief counsel to a Senate committee, began building cases against mob figures with new urgency. The Mafia had been operating in relative darkness for 30 years. After November 14, 1957, that darkness started to lift in ways no one inside the organization could reverse. Many of the bosses who attended blamed Genovese entirely. He had called the meeting. He had drawn 100 criminals to a single location in a state where law enforcement had already been watching Joseph Barbara's property. The catastrophic exposure that followed was laid squarely at his feet. His position, which had seemed unassailable just weeks earlier, became fragile almost overnight. Detained alongside the others that day, Gambino said nothing publicly and lost no standing in the aftermath. He had not called the meeting and had not chosen the location. Among the families, the blame that circulated in the weeks that followed landed nowhere near him. For many of the other bosses, he was simply a fellow casualty of Genovese's poor judgment. What happened next was as cold as anything Gambino had done in that barbershop. Working alongside Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky, Gambino helped orchestrate a scheme to remove Genovese permanently. A small-time criminal named Nelson Cantellops was paid a reported $100,000 to testify in federal court that he had personally witnessed Genovese arranging large purchases of heroin. The Narcotics Bureau wanted Genovese badly enough that they did not look too closely at how the testimony had come together. Genovese and 24 associates were arrested on drug charges. In 1959, Vito Genovese was convicted of conspiracy to distribute narcotics and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He was sent to Alcatraz. He died behind bars in February 1969, 10 years into his sentence, without ever regaining meaningful control over his organization. The man who had organized two of the most significant mob murders in a single year, who had believed he was on the verge of running the entire American Mafia, never left prison alive. With Genovese in a federal prison cell, the position of chairman of the commission was effectively vacant. There was only one man positioned to fill it. Gambino had helped remove every rival standing between himself and that seat, and he had done it without ever appearing to reach for it. By the early 1960s, Carlo Gambino was the de facto boss of bosses of the American Mafia, with authority over all 5 New York families and alliances, stretching to Chicago, New England, New Orleans, Florida, and Detroit. He had quietly arrived in America as an illegal stowaway 38 years before that meeting. Now he ran the country. Next up, the empire Gambino built once he had no rivals left to remove, and why the FBI, for years, could barely lay a finger on him. Section 4. The empire running the most powerful criminal organization in America. From the early 1960s onward, Carlo Gambino operated with a discipline his predecessors had rarely managed. He kept a low profile so deliberately, so consistently, that federal investigators spent years failing to fully grasp the scope of what he controlled. While the families around him accumulated enemies, invited prosecution, and fought internal wars that made the newspapers, Gambino quietly built an enterprise that touched almost every major industry in New York City. Labor racketeering was the foundation. The Gambino family took near total control of the International Longshoremen's Association across the New York and New Jersey waterfront, which meant they controlled every dock, every cargo shipment, and every worker at the busiest port system in the country. Ships arrived daily, carrying high-value goods. Spotters working the docks would identify the most profitable cargo, and by the time those goods were supposed to reach their destination, they had already been stolen, moved, and resold multiple times. Insurance claims covered what was missing on paper. The cycle was profitable and almost impossible to prosecute without cooperation from workers who had every reason to stay quiet. JFK Airport operated the same way. Gambino and Tommy Lucchese formed one of the most effective alliances in organized crime by the early 1960s, jointly controlling airport unions and cargo operations at what was then called Idlewild Airport. When Lucchese died in 1967 from a brain tumor, those interests passed to Gambino's son Thomas, cementing the family's grip on airport operations for years. The garment industry across Manhattan fell under similar pressure. Trucking companies paid tribute, union officials were placed or removed at the family's direction, and anyone who resisted found their deliveries delayed, their workers unavailable, their business strangled. Construction rackets, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and white-collar fraud rounded out an operation generating money on a scale the FBI could only estimate from the outside. Gambino discouraged his members from dealing in narcotics. He viewed it as a liability, believing the lengthy sentences drug convictions carried would push men toward cooperating with federal prosecutors. He preferred steady, lower-risk enterprises that kept his people out of interrogation rooms. Sources put the family's membership at around 500 made men during his peak years, with thousands of associates operating beneath them. Personal conduct was managed as carefully as any criminal operation. Arrested multiple times over the years. Indicted in 1970 for masterminding a major East Coast burglary ring, he was almost never prosecuted. When FBI agents arrived at his home to take him in, he offered them coffee and dessert before accompanying them calmly to booking. He was known to eat breakfast at a lower Manhattan diner, a grapefruit, an English muffin, and coffee, in plain sight of the federal agents growing increasingly frustrated by their inability to make anything stick. Heart disease became his most effective legal shield. Targeted for deportation after the Appalachin meeting exposed him to immigration authorities, he faced repeated hearings and court dates over the following years, and his heart condition seemed to flare with convenient timing each time one approached. In 1970, the Supreme Court upheld an order for his deportation, citing his illegal entry into the country 49 years earlier. His doctors argued he was simply too ill for removal. The deportation never happened. 1972 brought the one episode that came closest to rattling him. A crew of Irish criminals led by a man named James McBratney had been kidnapping Italian mob figures and demanding six-figure ransoms. When McBratney's crew grabbed Gambino's nephew Manny and murdered him, the response was swift. He called on a young captain named John Gotti, working under underboss Neil Della Croce. Gotti and two associates tracked McBratney to a tavern in Staten Island in May 1973 and shot him dead. Gambino was aware of Gotti before that night. Afterward, he paid considerably more attention. 50 years of criminal work across 2 continents, and a body count that sources have never been able to fully account for. Gambino remained atop a system that controlled entire industries, set prices, moved cargo, and placed people in positions of authority across New York. From the outside, it barely looked like anything at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, the one decision Carlo Gambino made in the final days of his life, and why it slowly unraveled nearly everything he had spent 50 years building. Section 5. The decision that undid everything. October 15, 1976. Carlo Gambino died at his home in Massapequa, Long Island, from a heart attack at the age of 74. His funeral procession drew 13 limousines, 12 private cars, and a flower carriage through the streets of Brooklyn. For a man who had spent 5 decades avoiding public attention, it was an unavoidably conspicuous send-off. The question of what came next had already been answered, quietly, in the days before he died. Choosing Paul Castellano as his successor was the most consequential decision of Gambino's career, and it was neither obvious nor accepted without friction. His longtime underboss, Aniello Della Croce, had spent years building loyalty across the family's street crews and was widely regarded as the natural heir. Della Croce was a traditional mobster, comfortable in the criminal world his soldiers lived in every day. Castellano was a businessman, focused on white-collar operations, and increasingly detached from the men below him. Gambino saw that as a strength and chose accordingly. Della Croce was serving a prison sentence for tax evasion when the succession was confirmed in November 1976 and could not contest it directly. He instructed his supporters to fall in line behind Castellano for the sake of stability. The family held together on the surface, but the resentment beneath never dissolved. Castellano moved into a large mansion on Tote Hill in Staten Island, grew more removed from the street crews with each passing year, and the men who had been loyal to Della Croce felt that distance and did not forget it. Among those men was John Gotti. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, he rose steadily through the family's ranks under Della Croce's protection. When Della Croce died of cancer in December 1985, the one figure holding the peace between Castellano's faction and the street crews beneath him was gone. 2 weeks later, on the evening of December 16, 1985, Castellano was shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan, alongside his underboss Thomas Bellotti. Gotti had ordered the killing and stepped into the position of boss without the commission moving to stop him. What followed was the precise opposite of every principle Gambino had spent his career establishing. Gotti appeared in public constantly, dressed in expensive tailored suits, gave press access freely, and became a fixture in the New York tabloids. The FBI planted a recording device above his regular meeting room in Queens, and the tapes captured conversations that went far beyond anything investigators had previously documented. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on 13 counts including murder and racketeering, sentenced to life in prison, and died there in 2002. One succession decision produced the resentment that led to Castellano's murder, which gave Gotti his opening, which brought the kind of sustained federal attention Gambino had spent 50 years preventing. Prosecutions through the 1990s and into the 2000s dismantled the remaining leadership layer by layer. The family still exists today in a reduced form, still carrying the name of a man who ran it from a lower Manhattan diner table, counting out his 30 daily pills, smiling at the agents across the room, and walking away clean every single time. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.